So by bringing decentralized finance right together with buyers and sellers and organizations who will provide insurance and other kind of financial products, you're squeezing the transactions costs out of the system and creating many, many more opportunities for hedgers and profit seekers. All the tools will be there for hedging, and all the tools will be there for profit maximization and trading.
Welcome to Better Worlds, where we explore how Web 3.0 connects our natural, manufactured, and virtual realities to create better lives for all in a more equitable and sustainable way.
Welcome to Better Worlds. My name is Aldyen Donnelly, and it's truly an honor to have this opportunity to ask some questions and spend some time with John Palmisano. John and I first met in the late 80s, but John is probably the only human being I know who has been intimately involved in the design, development, and execution of emissions markets since the very beginning. So, John, could you tell us a bit about, what's gone wrong in the past, what lessons we've learned that we need to take forward to make sure that we design carbon markets the right way?
Well, Alden, the foundation of emissions trading or any of these trading concepts, water trading, biodiversity trading, greenhouse gas trading, is the notion of property rights. How do you establish the property rights? Who gets the property rights? Who's grandfathered in? All of these issues. And that's a complicated issue because in every culture, property rights will be handled differently, rights to water, rights to land, et cetera. So in the US, where emissions trading started, we have a substantial body of knowledge on riparian rights, underground water rights, surface water rights, et cetera, to rely on, but still creating out of whole cloth rights to emission reduction credits was a complicated process that started in 1976 with the offset interpretive ruling and then became part of the Clean Air Act. But still, there were lots and lots of issues to resolve, like who owns what? How do we know they own it? Do we have a registry or a ledger someplace that keeps track of all this? Who has the various obligations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So that's going to vary from culture to culture. So when I was advising some European countries and some other countries in the past, it came to my attention that the word credit didn't translate from English into the exact corresponding word in another language. Big problem. So how do you create these property rights? That's what requires a partnership between industry, attorneys, economists, and policymakers. You got to get it right the first time.
Very interesting, especially the implications of the cultural differences. And I have to say, I didn't get it that way before you just said it right now. When I look at existing registries, whether they are for compliance or voluntary markets, it's still the case that the real interest in the ecosystem service that's delivered, land protection, reduced emission, is still ownership to that is still claimed twice everywhere. I get to sell you real interest in -1 ton, and you get to take -1 ton off your inventory, and I still keep -1 ton of my inventory in every registry worldwide. Uh, how did we not get that? If it's real property, the whole system has to include double entry bookkeeping from day one. How did we
Well,
miss that for so long?
well, it should require and should embrace double entry bookkeeping. Otherwise, you have what's called in the jargon of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, double counting. A Someone in an emerging economy creates an emission reduction. It's 100% perfect. It's beautiful. It's a showcase. It's wonderful. They trade it to an entity in the EU who trades it to an entity in the United States who uses it to demonstrate good corporate citizenry. Yet at the same time, perhaps the host country where that emission reduction is going to use that emission reduction to demonstrate that they're making progress towards their greenhouse gas goals. So you've got a problem. Two entities taking credit. You've the system. The system has to work just as you alluded to. There has to be double entry bookkeeping. credits have to be followed. That's why blockchain is so important, because you can track the provenance, that is where emission reduction came from, who had it, and then who used it. So these systems that were developed, notions of property rights many, many years ago, hundreds of years ago, and then incorporated into land and other kinds of uses, have to embrace the modern technologies too that are going to make transactions faster and faster. And that's what calls out opportunities for blockchain and other innovative technologies to take away those transactions costs and to make sure everything is correct in double entry bookkeeping.
So I want you to go deeper into the role that blockchain and Web3 can play in facilitating that. I must admit, I come at this with the bias as you know, I did my first, in those days, we called it emission reduction credit transactions, before other initiatives and registries came into existence. And in all of my purchase agreements, I had a clause in my contract that said, if you sell real interest in -1 to me, you have to publish your inventory if I ask you to, and you have to add +1 for every -1 you sell me. So when all of a sudden these, large institutions created a market that had no double entry bookkeeping, I kind of thought I don't understand this. But the one thing that stands out for me personally, I spent a lot of time talking about how you measure and report and verify. In my experience, if you've got to add 1 ton to your inventory when you sell real interest in -1 ton to me, you're much less inclined to be dealing in fake credits because there's that balancing entry, and you have to think of the implications of it. But if we're talking about who owns what and how tracing it, what is it about blockchain and Web3 that makes it easier for us to progress? And what are the insights that have to come together in the global community and leadership of the global community that we have to get to, whether or not we're using blockchain as a tool or a mechanism? So look at both sides of your experience. I want to hear about.
Well, let's separate blockchain from Web3 for a moment. Blockchain itself has certain inherent qualities that allow you to track possession from one legal entity, to another. So those are just the fundamental attributes of blockchain. Now, blockchain also has to work in a larger ecosystem, an energy ecosystem, an environmental ecosystem, an ecosystem of buyers and sellers who would appreciate the importance of provenance. If you imagine a world where bad money squeezes out good money, that is, if I can give you paper money to replace something that's gold, everybody will take paper. Everybody would prefer to keep the gold and pass on the paper money. This was always a problem. So if greenwash is accepted as legitimate, okay, then it devalues the currency. We're talking about a property right. We're talking about a currency, essentially a currency, all right? A currency that's used to satisfy an environmental obligation. That's how you pay for it under certain compliance regimes. So blockchain has this beautiful, beautiful quality, but it also requires entities to participate. So if I'm buying it from you, and then I'm passing it on to another, I have to, in some way, affirmatively record that. But blockchain automatically will record that because you're going to be picked up as the buyer and the seller. So it's an inherent attribute of the whole concept of blockchain. Web3 is something very, very is complementary, and that's the power of enhanced technology and enhancements to blockchain that allows you to do many things that one could not have imagined in the past. And one of those benefits would be what we would call DeFi, or decentralized finance. So if you're living in a world of smart contracts, which Web3 is really facilitating. Smart contracts are here today, but they're just taking off in terms of an item or a service is being used commercially. But it's taking off rapidly, where the first and second derivative is positive. Namely, it's going up at an increasing rate in terms of acceptance. So you've got smart contracts with decentralized finance, where I can borrow instantaneously if I meet certain criteria from lenders who are already lined up, ready to supply those services, or borrow against other kinds of tokens or coins or assets. So by bringing decentralized finance right together with buyers and sellers, and organizations who will provide insurance and other kind of financial products, you're squeezing the transactions costs out of the system and creating many, many more opportunities for hedgers and profit seekers. All the tools will be there for hedging, and all the tools will be there for profit maximization and trading.
So let's go back to first principles. Does that mean that in the future we're building together the better world? Nations where it's much more difficult to really sort of get clear on who owns what property are going to have a harder time coming to this market than nations that have more sophisticated or at least transparent property rights infrastructures in place? Or are there ways to use blockchain to introduce transparency and an ownership track record that makes it easier for those nations where property rights are more complicated to come in? Are we blocking them out, or are we opening the door for them to come in? I'm not sure.
Well, first, it's unlikely to be the nations, but the project developers who will be bringing in these important environmental and social benefits by way of the development of their projects, they're going to suffer. Because in the marketplace for ideas, in the marketplace for good deed doing, no company, no NGO, no major organization wants to be involved in greenwash. And it takes a fair amount of due diligence to pay attention to all the attributes that might not be there in a greenhouse gas emission reduction credit. So it takes the transactions costs are added to it, right? That we've got to look at who did what, when. I want the whole history, who owned the property, who did what. And if the country does not support double entry bookkeeping, or if there's a possibility of double counting, why would I want to be involved in that transaction? Why would I take a risk? I have a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Why do I want to take any kind of green risk when $1 million or $500,000 or $50,000 transaction? It makes no sense. Even if you were the most benevolent entity, you don't want to be involved in something that's tainted. So what's going to happen in this particular case, and you see it right now, the price for quality reductions, the quality reductions to meet a high standard is X, and it's 2/3 or 1/2 of X if there's questions, and it's 0 if it's screaming greenwash. You can have an emission reduction, but that doesn't mean you have a tradable emission reduction credit. That reduction is worth 0 if it doesn't meet certain standards. So there's a big range, and quality reigns.
So I also have another question that I keep struggling with and I don't know the answer to. But if the new real property we're creating is that credit, that digital asset that represents the verifiable delivery of an ecosystem service, it seems to me that if we denominate that credit in tons CO2 or 10 years set aside permanence questions, tons CO2, then what we're privatizing is the capacity of the atmosphere to store heat trapping gases within some limit we set. And that, to me, sounds like creating real property that is privatizing public realm. When we look back as an alternative to how we got tailpipe lead emissions down and reduce the emissions that were causing a hole in the ozone layer, we created a market where what everybody reported was their lead or ozone depleting substance equivalent to sort of virgin carbon content in their supply chains. And the new property was a credit which was over compliance with an agreed cap. And that's private property, not, in my view, privatizing public realm.
Well, I agree with you about thinking about what is the real property that we're creating, but I'm not sure if it's useful to think other than philosophically about the different paradigms. This is my point. It takes not just billions of dollars, but hundreds of millions of person hours to create a worldwide trading program. When this stuff started back in 1976, there were a handful of people who understood the offset interpretive ruling. By handful, I mean maybe 20, maybe 30, no more than 100 people in the world who understood it in 1976, what the implications were. There are 100,000 people who are working on one aspect or another of greenhouse gas emissions trading, renewable instruments from the RINS program, what's happening in the WCI, the Western Climate Initiative in California and Nova Scotia. Do I need to continue? China, New Zealand, Korea, all right. This concept has traction, and millions of person hours has gone into fitting this concept, which is very simple, market-based approaches, into the cultural and legal systems around the world. Changing that and switching at this point would be futile. There are many good points to be made for a carbon tax, and I can understand that and can even could support that. But the reality, the simple reality is, when you look at the human capital, the systems put in place, the history, the thousands of transactions, the culture, auditing procedures, MRV, do I need to continue? This concept has traction, and it's going to be extended to other commodities and should be extended to other kind of environmental commodities and ecological commodities, because we need these markets to reflect the price that we are paying for destroying the earth and destroying our habitat. And that's what markets are all about, establishing a price.
So how soon are these hundreds of thousands of person hours going to turn into something that most of us can understand? How much time do we need? And I think about that. You mentioned both Nova Scotia and California, and as you know, I'm one of the primary authors of the Nova Scotia cap and trade regulation. I could go on about how very different it is from California's, and setting aside which is preferred, those are not fungible units at this point in time. So what's the pathway to get from where we are to something that is a little more fungible looking in the units that are being output by all the different jurisdictions?
My own personal view is it's futile to think about a single unit, a single numeraire for how we're going to measure carbon reductions all around the world. Every country is going to have a different natural endowment. Some have a lot of coal-fired power plants. Poland's in a much different situation than Iceland. Iceland has no coal-fired power plants. For every country to take a 10% reduction, Iceland, Norway, it wouldn't be simple. There's no fat there for them to take it out of, whereas other countries have a lot of coal-fired power plant or other emission sources. Also, there's different combinations of political power that resides within industry. So, and then you have culture. You have culture and you have legal histories and precedent. So why would there possibly be a one-size-fits-all regulatory program other than based on the very simple concept that we can move the fulcrum? We can move the fulcrum and let the market establish the price and do the allocations. If one thinks that emissions trading is going to be a tool that's going to solve every equity problem, then one's making a mistake. If one thinks it's going to be a very important tool for establishing economically efficient solutions to big social problems, then you're going to be a winner, because you've got a history, a track record of 40-some years in the United States and many, many years in other countries since the Kyoto Protocol. Lots of transactions, lots of good environmental benefits, lots of good social benefits. Why possibly switch to another worldwide regulatory regime where it's more difficult than Sisyphusian?
I don't know if you made me really happy or really sad. Great, John. So does that translate into, really, we're looking at a future where there are going to be unique strategies that are going to start, they're probably not going to be sector specific, but there might be some, but they're at least going to be nation level specific, and then it's going to be all about carbon border adjustments? Or is there something else in our future?
Well, I think that you'll find more interest in carbon border adjustment taxes around the world. Let's face it, we went from a simple concept, really simple concept that just applied to the LA metropolitan area, to then many other areas, and then many other countries. And then countries start to embrace it and say, why don't we have a domestic trading program like maybe India will do, and maybe Indonesia is going to have, which will be different. It has to be different than the New Zealand program, because the culture, legal system of property rights, and the endowment of industry and political pressures are going to be idiosyncratic to each country. So when each country develops a program, sure, the metric for 1 ton, the price will be a little bit different. But do you not expect exchanges to arise where I'll swap you 3 WCIs for 2 EUAs, European Union allowances, versus Western climate initiatives, or 7.5 New Zealand reductions for 5 Korean? Why would you expect why would you expect that not to happen? It's going to happen. I'm going to be part of it. Perhaps you're going to be part of that. But that's just the reality. That's the way markets go. Increase transparency, increase liquidity, especially in a market like this, which has to increase in terms of volume and activity over time.
It's interesting. A perspective that I think is important, and we don't hear things like what you just said from very many experts very often. I also think it's interesting that in early in your comment, you referred to, you didn't say the word, but the reclaim program, which is, if you look back in history, the longest continuous it's no longer operating, but was the longest continuously operating emissions market in history, where all sorts of different criteria pollutants were traded across multiple sectors. And I got to say, I wonder why more of us aren't at least contemplating how reclaim worked when we go to design our regionally specific systems, because there was a lot in reclaim that I don't see people thinking about or replicating these days. And I wonder if that's a mistake.
Well, the LA area, or what's called the South Coast Air Quality Management District, has been the home of basically all these concepts. We had first the offset policy, then you had reclaim, which was more marketable permit oriented. And the South Coast Air Quality Management District has, if not the best team of engineers and policy people in the world, pretty going close to it, because they've got a big problem in the metropolitan area, and they have a constituency that's willing to pay for, in a limited way, to pay for these emission reductions so they can hit their national ambient air quality standard goals. So there's local goals where they use these tools to achieve progress toward meeting these air quality standards. And then you have these international goals, which are a little bit different. All right. But there's that experience. It's the human capital. I keep coming back to that notion about the human capital that's required. We are exchanging human capital for physical capital. That's what we're doing all the time when there's an emissions trade. Behind that transaction may be a lot of engineering studies for a piece of equipment. But who was doing those engineering studies? Who was doing the paperwork? And you're very, very well familiar, some of your audience probably is, with all the paperwork that has to be produced to justify an emission reduction becoming an emission reduction credit. The good fairy doesn't produce that. They're good men and women, professional engineers and attorneys who produce that work. That's the human capital foundations of these property rights, okay? So there's a large literature, but everyone, my friend, is not as familiar with it as you are. All right. And there are some benefits to that experience, just like any good chess player remembers all the previous games, or many of the previous games. You've got pattern recognition. You've been down this road. I've been down this road. We know others who've been down this road. By the virtue of pattern recognition, you can look at a situation and say, this is not going to work. You're only going to wind up with 5 trades a year. Why are you even going down this path? You'll be rigorous, but nothing will happen. So that's the benefit of experience but a lot of folks who are coming new to this rapidly growing area is not going to look back to anything that happened before, 2010, because the rules, might not be applicable.
Well, all I can say is I think we're running out of time, but I think they need to call you up and get some help and introductions to others beyond you who have that experience. The thing that I get concerned about is when we look worldwide at all of the existing voluntary market registries and all of the credits that they've issued since they were first introduced. The accumulated sum of the credit issuance is less than 20% of 1 year's discharges of greenhouse gas emissions by the top 225 corporations in the world, top in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And to date, 47% of all those credits that have been issued have never been bought by anybody. So we've mobilized the interest in the market, but we haven't built anything that's robust yet. And we've got to do that soon. And I think people like you have to be part of getting there.
Well, let me just comment quickly. The robustness comes with transactions. And just look at how ideas diffuse. Some ideas and some systems diffuse very, very rapidly, and they really take off. But there's always a risk in being the first one to adopt a Nehru jacket, or to import Yugos, or to import another technology that might work well in another country, but bring it into your country. So there's a lot of risks. And for the advocates early on, there was risk of humiliation. What happens if this backfires, doesn't look good on my resume, et cetera. Now that risk has been squeezed out of the system. There's N+1 studies about the benefits of these trading concepts. The key is fitting these concepts into the cultural norms and the economic systems in the developing countries. And the other key, obviously, is for not just industry, but society as a whole to really get motivated, because we're going to blow past 1.5 like a Maserati passing a Volkswagen, and that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. So emissions trading is not the solution. It's part of the solution, and every part has to be there, or we're not going to meet our goals.
John, just got to say, I always love it when I get a chance to hear your insights and your points of view, and we've got to do it more often. And thank you for participating in this
Aldyen, thank you.
series.
You take care.